Frexit is peace. Why a fringe chant is suddenly testing France's place in Europe. Why Frexit is peace is echoing through Paris again. The latest confirmed update is that a Frexit march in central Paris over the weekend has pushed a once-fringe demand, France leaving the European Union, back into the public conversation, with crowds chanting slogans, including Frexit is peace and Frexit is France. This is not just another protest clip going viral. It is a compression event. Farm anger over trade, broader cost of living stress, and political distrust are being packed into a single, simple slogan that travels faster than any policy detail. The overlooked hinge is procedural. The biggest Frexit energy right now is being fueled by EU decision rules and legal timelines, not by a sudden mass conversion to exiting the bloc. The story turns on whether French political leaders treat Frexit as a pressure valve or as a live referendum threat. Key points. A Paris march, organized by Les Patriotes, revived Frexit messaging in the streets, with chants framing EU membership as a threat to sovereignty and peace. The trigger is not one issue. It is a bundle: trade, especially Mercosur, farming income, regulation, and distrust of elites and institutions. The EU-Mercosur trade deal fight is acting as a catalyst because it is concrete: imports, standards, prices, and who wins under the rules. France's ability to stop EU outcomes is more limited than many assume, which makes leave the system rhetoric politically efficient. Expect a near-term contest between symbolic escalation, bigger marches, louder slogans, and institutional containment, legal delays, concessions, tighter border checks. The risk is not imminent Frexit. It is a trust fracture that turns every EU decision into a domestic legitimacy crisis. Background. Frexit is shorthand for France, withdrawing from the European Union, the French analog of Brexit. In practical terms, it would require a major domestic political mandate and a formal exit process under EU treaties. A street rally cannot flip this fois. The march at the center of this moment was organized by Les Patriotes, a sovereignist movement led by Florian Philippot. Its messaging links EU membership to lost control over borders, trade policy, and foreign policy alignment. The wider context matters. In January, French farmers staged major protests against the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, arguing it would expose them to cheaper imports produced under different constraints and standards. That farm unrest has not stayed neatly inside agriculture. It has become a story about fairness, rules, and who gets protected. So when crowds chant Frexit, it is often less a technical plan than a verdict. The system feels rigged, and leave becomes the most emotionally legible response. Analysis: the Mercosur deal as a political accelerator, not a side issue. Trade deals are usually abstract until they hit a price tag. Mercosur is different because it is easily visualized. Beef, poultry, sugar, and other agricultural goods moving across borders, under rules most voters do not feel they consented to. For farmers, the argument is simple. European producers face tight environmental and welfare rules and higher costs. If imports arrive under looser conditions, the market punishes the compliant producer. Whether that is fully true in every product line is less important politically than the perception that standards become self-harm when they are not enforced at the border. Plausible scenarios. Now, containment through concessions. Paris pushes for tougher safeguards, inspection regimes, and compensation packages. Signposts, new enforcement measures, targeted subsidies, and mirror clauses language, returning to official messaging. Escalation through symbolism. Activists keep tying Mercosur to national humiliation, widening the coalition beyond farmers. Signposts, more rallies, broader anti-EU slogans, and union and non-union participation converging. Institutional delay becomes the battleground. Legal and parliamentary timelines turn into a political countdown clock. Signposts, court referrals, parliamentary scheduling fights, public statements framing delays as victories. Why Frexit equal to peace lands right now? The peace framing is strategically chosen. It isn't mainly about trade. It is about agency. The feeling that France is pulled into commitments, economic, regulatory, or geopolitical, without meaningful consent. The subject is powerful because it merges two anxieties: the everyday, income, food prices, regulation, jobs, and the other anxiety is existential, encompassing war, sovereignty, identity, and national direction. That combination is hard to rebut with technocratic talking points. Here are the safeguards. Does not answer. Who is steering the country? Plausible scenarios. Messaging war. Government figures counter with EU, equal to protection narratives. Standards. Security. Bargaining power. Signposts. Coordinated ministerial messaging. Emphasis on EU protections. References to common market benefits. Narrative capture. Frexit actors become the default voice of ordinary frustration, regardless of policy realism. Signposts. Mainstream media panels featuring Frexit voices more often. Poll movement on EU trust metrics. The Macron problem. When every EU file becomes domestic legitimacy. The mechanics of EU decision-making and alliance management can trap President Emmanuel Macron in rhetorical opposition to a deal. That gap between what leaders say they want and what the system can deliver is where street slogans breed. If voters perceive France opposed it, but it happens anyway, the conclusion becomes France is not sovereign in the ways that matter. From there, the slogan writes itself. Plausible scenarios. Hardening stance. Paris draws clearer red lines and tries to build blocking coalitions earlier. Signposts. Coalition diplomacy. Joint statements with other skeptical capitals and explicit blocking minority language. Strategic ambiguity. Paris signals opposition while privately negotiating carve-outs. Signposts. Quiet technical adjustments, enforcement tweaks, compensation mechanisms framed as wins. What most coverage misses. The hinge is this: Frexit momentum rises fastest when EU outcomes feel unblockable at the national level, even if exit itself is unlikely. That changes incentives. If leaders cannot credibly promise to stop unpopular EU decisions, opponents stop debating them and start attacking the decision system. Fix the deal becomes leave the EU, because it is a simpler political weapon and a clearer identity marker. Two signposts to watch in the next days and weeks. Legal and procedural moves that delay or reroute trade implementation, because delay can be sold as victory, and victory fuels mobilization. Polling or party positioning shifts that pull Frexit language closer to the mainstream, because legitimacy spreads through imitation, not persuasion. International spillovers. Europe's trade strategy meets Europe's trust crisis. Europe's case for Mercosur is strategic: diversify markets, secure supply chains, and reduce vulnerabilities. The countercase is social. If the deal becomes a symbol of elites choosing global strategy over local survival, it inflames the political center. The more Europe tries to act as a unified trade power, the more it risks triggering national backlash in countries where legitimacy is already brittle. Plausible scenarios. The EU doubles down. Leaders treat backlash as noise and proceed. betting on long-term gains. Signposts, firm implementation timelines, minimal redesign, and heavy emphasis on export benefits. The EU softens via enforcement. Brussels sells the same deal with harder border controls and tougher compliance rhetoric. Signposts, new inspection language, residue limits, enforcement funding, and rapid response trade safeguards. What happens next? The immediate question is whether the Paris Frexit march becomes a repeatable template, farm anger plus sovereignty language plus viral spectacle, or whether it stays a niche event that spikes online and fades. Who is most affected? Farmers and rural supply chains are the most affected, primarily due to the tangible impact of import competition and standards enforcement. The next most affected group is centrist politics, as the discrepancy in credibility between national commitments and EU results can be politically damaging. Longer-term concerns about EU trade governance arise from the fact that low trust makes future deals more difficult. Short-term, 24 to 72 hours, weeks, expect more mobilization attempts and louder linkage between trade, censorship, free speech rhetoric, and foreign policy. Long-term, months, years. The risk is institutional delegitimization, where EU membership becomes a permanent domestic wedge rather than a settled fact. The main consequence is that if voters believe key economic outcomes are decided outside national control, they reward movements that offer control, even if the promised mechanism is unrealistic. Real-world impact. A small beef producer watches supermarket prices flatten and wonders if competing imports will set the ceiling for years, even as compliance costs keep climbing. A mid-size food processor delays hiring because margins are uncertain. One policy shift on imports or standards can wipe out planning assumptions. A logistics firm sees new protest days become a scheduling variable, building disruption costs into contracts that used to run on routine. A city worker who is not anti-EU still shares the Chant video, not because they want to exit, but because it expresses their frustration in 6 words. France's EU fork in the road is about control, not just exit. It is easy to treat Frexit as theater, loud, emotional, and ultimately unserious. That is the wrong red. The more important signal is that institutional complexity is losing the narrative war. When the system feels too distant, people stop negotiating within it and start rejecting it. The Chant is not a policy paper. It is a pressure gauge. Either France and the EU find a way to make trade, standards, and enforcement feel fair and controllable, or Frexit rhetoric continues to expand as the default language of protest. Watch for 3 concrete signposts: how swiftly Mercosur timelines move, whether legal challenges slow implementation, and whether mainstream parties begin borrowing Frexit framing. If those trends converge, this weekend's Chant will look less like noise and more like an early marker of a deeper political shift.